Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that takes your favorite old school D&D monsters, converts them into 5th edition, goes over their lore and ecology, and gives you hot, spicy tips on how to use them in your D&D campaign. Maybe you're not even a DM and you're just here because delving into a fantastical world of monsters seems like a good alternative to engaging in whatever's happening outside in the real world cartoon apocalypse. I wouldn't know, I haven't been outside in days. Today I have a truly remarkable monster for us to take a look at, and is it just me or is it getting kinda cold in here? Oh look everyone, it's the Zigzagool! How's it going up there? What's that? You say this video is sponsored by the Seeds of Decay Kickstarter? Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that later, but for now, I was gonna do this whole video dressed up in my winter gear, and it's been like 45 seconds, and it's already way too hot in here. Commit to the bit, commit to the bit. All right, let's do this. This is the monster of the week, the Zigzagool. It wasn't satisfied with destroying the Titanic, so this sentient iceberg is now here to wreak havoc in the world of D&D. I gotta tell you, this monster might actually be physically the largest creature we have ever covered on this channel. No, seriously, look at this artwork. See those little specks floating around its body? Yeah, those are adult white dragons. Notoriously huge creatures. The Zigzagool are elder elementals from the para-elemental plane of ice. If that sentence means nothing to you, please allow me to explain the elemental planes in 20 seconds or less. Everybody knows about the classic elemental planes of existence. You got your earth, you got your water, you got your fire, you got your air. But did you know that all these planes border each other in the Great Wheel cosmology? And between each border of these elemental worlds is a small sliver where the multiverse combines. These smaller elemental combo planes are called para-elemental planes, and they're pretty wild. Between fire and air, you have the elemental plane of smoke. Between fire and earth, you have the elemental plane of magma. Earth and water gives you the plane of mud, or the marsh plane, as any of its local denizens will implore you when they hear you call it otherwise. Come on guys, it's mud. You live in the New Jersey of elemental planes, it's okay. Just call it what it is. And between the plane of water and air, of course, we have ice. The plane of ice is a pretty cool place, and in much the same way that the greater elemental planes are occupied by elemental beings, the para-elemental planes follow suit. So back to the Zigzagool. As one would expect, it is an ice elemental. But it's not just any ordinary guy made out of ice. It is an elder ice elemental, which means A, not only is it deserving of your respect, but B, maybe you should go visit it at the home once in a while. But for real, in 5th edition lore, the only place where elder elementals are even really mentioned is in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. But basically all you really need to know about them is that they are ancient and powerful elemental beings who have survived eons, allowing their essence to grow both in size and in power. The Zigzagool was first printed in D&D 3rd edition as part of the Epic Level Handbook. This supplement was geared towards dungeon masters and players who wanted to take their game well beyond the level 20 cap. There were rules for new feats, crazy magic items, epic level spells, and of course, a whole slew of new earth-shattering monsters. So today we're gonna go over just exactly what a Zigzagool is, why it is, what it can do, what it's capable of in combat, and then of course we're gonna go over some plot hooks and story ideas so that you can employ this monster in your own D&D campaign. But before we start digging into the story and ecology of the Zigzagool, we need to understand what it's capable of and how it fights. Because oh boy, does it fight. So get your warmest jacket because it is time for...
Let's kick some ice.
When converting this monster from 3rd edition to 5th, I had some pretty significant challenges along the way. Normally, I try my best to make the 5th edition conversion as true and faithful to the original printing of the monster as possible. But in this case, that just wasn't really an option. Anyone who's looked through the Epic Level Handbook knows exactly why that is. For starters, this monster was originally printed with a challenge rating of 36. It had more hit points than God, and really made me question whether I was looking at a stat block for a monster or some kind of small ice planet. The problem here is that of course we want the Zigzagoon to be this massive endgame threat, but we also want it to be usable. So what I did was I compared it to the only other monsters that it has anything in common with in all of 5th edition, that being the Elder Elementals from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. Using these stat blocks, I was able to pin down just exactly what the Zigzagoon should look like in 5th edition with bounded accuracy taken into account. And personally, I'm really excited to unleash it on my players.
Bounded accuracy is the design philosophy used by Wizards of the Coast and the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition team to limit the amount of numerical bonuses given to players and monsters. This is meant to keep things streamlined and ensure the numbers are easy to understand.
So I proudly present to you for the first time in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, the Zigzagoon. While it may not have that original challenge rating of 36, the Zigzagoon in 5th edition is going to be clocking in at a CR of 22, thus still putting it in the top 1% of all D&D monsters in terms of power level. To start off, I want to talk about its core stats. The Zigzagoon has an armor class of 20, 328 hit points, proficiency in wisdom and charisma saving throws, as well as immunity to cold, acid, and poison damage, and it's also immune to a whole bunch of different status effects. Okay, I have to lose the scarf. I think I might actually die if I don't take this off. Oh my god, it's like 1,000 degrees in here. It's also going to be especially hard to take down due to its legendary resistances. But when we're talking combat, killing the Zigzagoon isn't even the party's biggest problem, as just surviving in its proximity presents a whole challenge of its own. It only gets 2 claw attacks per turn, but with a plus 17 to hit, that basically means it gets to hit something twice per turn. Each one of those attacks is going to be slamming for 4d8 plus 10 damage. That's an average of 32 damage per hit, with an average of 64 damage for the entire round. But in an unforeseen twist, bringing us back to one of my personal favorite monsters, the Grey Render, the Zigzagoon has access to the Rend trait. That means that if it hits the same target with both of those claw attacks, it's going to be trying to tear them to shreds, causing an additional huge chunk of damage. 4d8, but who's counting? Overall, if you get hit by both claw attacks plus the rend damage, that's an average of 82 damage total. That's enough to straight up decimate some classes in one round, unless you're a mad guy with a axe. But that's just its raw damage output. Thanks to another trait called Frigid, this bad boy is able to induce numbing cold on anything it touches. Clawing the shit out of somebody counts as touching them, meaning that whenever it connects with one of these attacks, the target has to make a DC 20 Constitution saving throw, otherwise they are put under an effect which is basically the same as the slow spell. Mechanically, that means you're taking a -2 to armor class and dexterity rolls. You can't use your reaction, and on your turn you can only use either an action or a bonus action, not both. Also, your speed gets cut in half. So I imagine this is going to throw a wrench or maybe an entire goddamn toolbox into the party's plans as they try to take down this colossal monstrosity. I can already see the comments. I know it's an elemental, not a monstrosity. You're not getting me on this one, gang. It also has a lovely action called Biting Cold, which is basically a white dragon's breath weapon turned up to -11. That's a temperature joke. It can unleash a 300-foot cone of ice that deals 12d6 damage to everything in its path. Plus, it has a worst case scenario save condition, which means that if you fail the saving throw, which is a DC of 20, by more than 5, you are frozen solid. You can try to break free on each of your turns, but the DC is insanely high, so your best bet is going to be another party member hitting you with any amount of fire damage to melt the ice. It does also have a couple legendary actions, one of which allows it to move, the other allows it to make a claw attack, pretty standard stuff. However, its third legendary action allows it to cast the spell Wall of Ice. By the time your party is high enough level to actually be fighting this thing, there's a really good chance they're going to have many tools in their kit capable of dealing with a wall of ice. But in a lot of cases, depending on the battlefield, it will allow the Zigzagoon some degree of control over which lanes can be passed through and which ones are blocked off. It's also an excellent way for it to get in a pretty good amount of cold damage on its off turns as well. And if your party doesn't have a way to deal with these walls of ice, well, good luck. Normally, this is the point in the video where I would give my advice on building an encounter with this monster and running it in combat, but, I mean, just look at it. Look at this thing. It's a giant Godzilla made of ice. There's only so much you can do with that. I do, however, think it's worth mentioning two abilities I cut from the stat block, which will help you build a really interesting encounter with this monster. The original 3rd edition printing of this monster had it with an action that allowed it to summon an adult white dragon 5 times per day. That shit is wild, but we don't really need to clutter its stat block with another ability that basically tantamounts to there are white dragons around it sometimes. If you want to include white dragons as part of your Zigzagoon encounter, simply have the white dragons be around it. Maybe they're nesting on its shoulders, or perhaps they're drawn towards the massive amount of magic and cold energy that's being emitted by this thing. As it freezes everything over, I imagine a white dragon would be pretty drawn to that. The point is, we don't need it to have an action that says it can summon white dragons. Just have the white dragons naturally be a part of the encounter if you want them there. Treat them like those little fish that hang out on sharks. It's super weird that in this analogy, the dragons aren't the sharks, but that's just the kind of day we're having. The other ability I axed from this creature is that in 3.5, it has a permanent Dire Winter spell affecting it at all times. If you don't know what that is, it's because Dire Winter is not a spell in 5th edition. What the spell does is it creates a 1,000-foot radius winter storm. It caused some cold damage to anyone within it every turn unless they had resistance to cold. So much like the dragons, we don't really need an ability that tells us this colossal raging elder elemental creates a winter storm around it. I intentionally left this out here so that you as the DM can determine what level of effect you want the winter storm to have on your players from a mechanics perspective. Because I feel like it goes without saying that there's going to be a crazy blizzard around this thing at all times, right? But if you want it to be just a descriptive narrative thing that doesn't actually impact the dice rolls, you can do that. You can just describe the storm as it's blowing everything around. That's fine. But if you want to up the challenge for your players a little bit, there's a lot of ways that a winter storm could affect combat. Perhaps like the spell that this idea is inspired by, the winter storm causes a d6 cold damage to everyone every round as long as they're not resistant to cold. Maybe the high winds make it impossible to fly without making a successful athletics check. Or perhaps the snow limits movement, or maybe visibility gets cut in half. There's a ton of stuff you can do here, but just keep in mind that everything you're adding here is going to make this encounter more difficult. And it's already going to be a pretty difficult fight. But with that said, I would definitely encourage you to kind of explore what possibilities a blizzard might hold for running combat, not just with this creature, but with every creature. We need more weather-based mechanics for combats. Throw some icy curveballs at your group once in a while. But now that we understand how it fights, let's move along and talk about a few, oh my, I gotta take that, I have to, I'm dying here, guys. Now that we understand how it fights, let's move along and talk about some. It might seem like at first glance the Zigzagoon is a one-trick giant walking iceberg monster, but there are actually a lot of really interesting and creative ways you can kind of throw this at your players. Something to keep in mind is that these elementals are not very intelligent. They operate mostly on instinct, which is pretty common with elementals in 5th edition, so treating them as a literal force of nature is always a strong option. Now in the original lore, they actually didn't come from the plane of ice. They lived on the material plane and were often buried deep beneath the Arctic regions of the world. I always found this so weird because the Epic Level Handbook came out 1 year after the Manual of the Multiverse. The Manual of the Multiverse was the book that introduced the concept of para-elementals and the planes of ice in New Jersey and whatever. So it's not like we didn't have a precedent set for dudes made out of ice already. The two books even have Bruce R. Cordell as a main contributing author. And there are also a handful of other design designers in common between the two products. So I don't really know what happened there, but I guess the fact remains, and the point I'm trying to make is there are multiple ways to spin the Zigzagool's appearance and existence. If you wanted to go with the original lore and have it be this ancient frozen titan lurking beneath the Arctic Circle, just waiting to be set loose upon the world, that could be pretty cool. Maybe as a result of global warming due to overuse of magic or something, the polar ice caps are melting and uh-oh, now the Zigzagool's loose. You guys tell I've been reading a bunch of Dark Sun. After last week, I just read through a bunch of Dark Sun stuff and it was great. If you do decide to go with the Elder Elemental route, the most important question to ask yourself is just exactly how did this thing get from the elemental plane of ice to the material plane? This section on Elder Elementals in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes tells us that summoning one of these things is almost impossible. And even for those who would be able to achieve such a thing, which there are very few individuals capable of doing so, it would most certainly be self-destructive, meaning that only the most powerful and most unhinged elemental cultists out there are going to even attempt such a thing.
The blood will freeze in my hands. Yes. If I must suffer, humanity will suffer with me. I shall repay them for sentencing me to a life without the warmth of human comfort. I will blanket the city in endless winter.
To take a page out of Mr. Freeze's book, perhaps an unhinged and powerful individual takes it upon themselves to extract a Zigzagool from its frozen tomb or summon one here as a means of getting vengeance on a kingdom for some past slight. Maybe your villain is actually an ancient white dragon who hopes to manipulate the power of the Zigzagool to coat everything in ice. For a slightly more out-of-the-box encounter,
Night! Hell! Freeze us over.
I promise all of these plot hooks are not going to just be references to Mr. Freeze puns, but imagine if a rift formed and one of these things got through into the first layer of the 9 hells. Avernus literally freezing over could be a pretty compelling plot device and environment for a D&D adventure. Maybe the demons are making a big push against the devils and the devils are too wrapped up in the blood war, or perhaps the Zigzagool is even part of a demon plot to take over Avernus and get an edge in the blood war. Regardless of what reason you come up with, it could be possible that the devils need to outsource the solution to this problem because they're too busy dealing with something else. Enter the adventuring party. If we want the story to be a bit more apocalyptic, we could always gear up for
The Ice Age!
Okay, last one. I promise. But an encroaching ice age with a Zigzagool or maybe even a group of them at the center of it all could be pretty compelling too. As written, they don't speak any languages because they're just so massive and so primordial in nature that ironically, they can't speak primordial. But if you wanted to make one of these guys more intelligent and kind of have them act as your big bad evil guy for a campaign, that could hold a lot of really interesting ideas too. A Zigzagool would be an amazing self-proclaimed ruler over the para-elemental plane of ice. Them seeking to expand their domain into the material plane could be a really interesting plot. I imagine the other elemental rulers might have a few things to say about that, or they might be completely indifferent. But if the Emperor of Ice decides that the small plane that they've been relegated to simply isn't enough, invading the material plane could be a really attractive option. Something I also want to touch on here is, as I mentioned, the Zigzagool is going to be extremely hard for any adventuring party to take down, especially if you include dragons and inclement weather. If you're looking for that truly epic encounter for a high-level party, this is it. But if your party isn't ready to take on the Zigzagool in a direct fight, that doesn't mean you can't use it in your game. These monsters make excellent set pieces and villainous devices. Perhaps not killing the Zigzagool itself, but stopping a villain from summoning it in the first place is the party's actual goal here. And if they fail, you now have a very tangible way to show them the cost of that failure. You could even have the party tasked with finding some sort of ancient and powerful magical item that will allow them to either banish it or destroy the Zigzagoon without having to actually engage in a man versus mountain cage match. There's a lot you can do with this monster, and I definitely encourage you to get weird with it. If you have found this video inspiring, helpful, or just plain entertaining, please leave a like, leave a comment. It helps me out a ton, and I just want to say as well, I always see you guys commenting down there. Our community is super active. I always see you suggesting monsters and telling me about plans for the monsters we talk about, so thank you. I also want to take a moment here and give a special shout out to this episode's sponsor, the Seeds of Decay Kickstarter. A crack has formed in the darkness of the always green forest, leaking rot and decay. Trees are withering and crops are failing to mature. Strange, twisted creatures have been seen in the shadows. The Rot Weaver has returned. Will you save the forest from the spreading decay before it's too late? Seeds of Decay is a brand new adventure for 5th edition that brings you into the dark and whimsical world of daubers. Enjoy fully illustrated quests with unique maps, NPCs, monsters, and much more. Along with this grand adventure comes over 60 unique and scalable monsters that will tangle up every encounter, as well as new magic items, spells, races, classes, and subclasses. And if that wasn't enough, a brand new system for building contraptions and tools. You can check out the Kickstarter at seedsofdecay.com or by using the link in the description below. Once again, just want to say thanks to our lovely sponsor, and speaking of lovely things, I want to give a special shout out to all of you lovely patrons out there. Thank you for directly supporting me and bringing me back week after week to talk about crazy, weird, giant mountain monster men. As always, if you do want to run this monster, everything you need will be in the description below in the form of a stat block, which I have housed within a Google document down there. And if you are one of those aforementioned lovely patrons, you of course will get the 5th edition monster manual style stat block for your DM folder posted on the Patreon page. So be sure to hit up Patreon and check that out too if that sounds interesting to you. Most importantly though, guys, thank you so much for watching. There's been a ton of new folks lately, so if you're new to the channel, thanks for being here. I appreciate you. I'm happy to see ya. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for watching. Until the next one.
Cool party.